Yeah, in a way, though, I don't think this is too surprising because it's of the nature of national identity, modern national identity, post-Westphalian national identity since the 18th century in Europe. It's of the nature of it to be, you used the expression, Benedict Anderson's expression, to be imaginary. I mean, you imagine yourself as English. You don't know the other English people. There's too many of them, and they're too far away. So it's because it's created in the imagination. Both the reality of it and the sense of threat to it don't have to be about your neighbour because your fellow English men and women are not your neighbours. They're the fellow inhabitants of this part of the British Isles, and then if you're Scottish, that part of the British Isles, and just a few miles away, Welsh, that part of the British Isles. These are, and remember, I was just looking this up this morning. Wales in the first millennium was 4 mutually hostile, constantly at war, separate kingdoms. That's right. They came together eventually, partly against the English.
That's right.
These are long historical processes, but they're fundamentally, especially in the modern period, where ordinary people they read newspapers, and now they have television and radio and the internet, so individuals have a sense of as it were, what Britain is, which has nothing to do with who's in the house next door, or in the village, or in the town. So it's not, I think, so surprising that because it's created that way in the imagination, you can feel a sense of threat, which is also, in some sense, imaginary, though we have to remember the imagination is kind of the realest thing we've got. As you said, I mean, imagination is how we live. That's what distinguishes us from the beasts. Human beings live in the imagination. So to say it's imaginary is not to say it's unreal, it's to say how it's real.
But I think that what Kwame says is absolutely right. So the perception, when politicians confront this issue, they have to deal with the perception more than the reality, because the reality itself is contested. I mean, you just have to look at the Brexit vote and the debates. Every bit of statistics is contested. There are all sorts of issues with causality that politicians have to sort of take as read, that are very difficult. So as Kwame says, the battle is really in the imagination. And that imagination in Britain, particularly, is stirred up, or has been stirred up a lot by the newspapers. So one of the extraordinary things about the whole Brexit issue was that David Cameron thought he could win a referendum, which he could have done, but he forgot the fact that he himself had been campaigning against the EU. I mean, the reason he got the Conservative leadership was because he said he would pull the Tories out of the EPP. So he himself, having known the force and used the force of Euroscepticism, sought to kill Euroscepticism once and for all. And we all know how that happened. So, one of the problems we've had in the modern era is that politicians have ridden the tiger of sort of perception and imagination, only to find themselves swallowed up by it. And this is what I think, Kwame would know more, being an American citizen, but that's where I saw with Trump. Yeah. I mean, he basically called out the Republican establishment on all, they'd pandered to xenophobia, they'd pandered to all of those things. And he essentially just said, well, you're fakes, you're not actually doing anything about it. And that was part of his strength, I think.
It's worth remembering, though, this is a little bit off topic from our conversation, but it is worth remembering that 3 million more Americans voted for the lady than voted for the gentleman. So now that, of course, somebody wins, it makes a big difference, but it doesn't mean that people are roughly, I think, mostly where they were before, and there's a vast reservoir of positive sentiments. There is a vast proportion of the American population, many of them white people whose ancestors came hundreds of years ago, who are confidently happy in the idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants. They reasonably, I think any reasonable person thinks there ought to be some limits, and that it ought to be done legally, and that people who are around in violation of the law you need to bring the law back into conformity with reality somehow. And there are many possible ways of doing that, but everybody agrees, every sane person, I think, agrees that ought to be done.